Hello and welcome to our next video. In this lesson, we're going to be working with controllers and views, ultimately. So in the last section, we were building the models. That's the M in the MVC. And this time we're going to be working with the controllers, and we'll scaffold out the views by default here. So that's the C and the V, or the V and the C in MVC. So models, views, and controllers. So the really nice thing about this is it's wired up in a way that we can do a lot of the work without having to do a lot of the work. But we do need to create a controller. So if you haven't already, the very most important thing you can do is make sure that you've built after you have a contact or after you have your models. And if you make any changes, you need to also build. If you don't build, then what's going to happen is you won't be able to scaffold your controllers correctly. So you can see I had already built, so it just basically said it was already up to date. So now what we're going to do is add a new controller. Now MVC works by convention with .NET, which means whatever my controller name is, that's going to be important because that will point me to the right place on my web page. It will also kind of line up. So I have a contact model. So my controller should probably be a contact controller or a contacts controller if you really want to have an S in there. Let's go ahead and just say we're going to add a new controller here by right-clicking on controllers, add controller. And what I want to do is add an MVC5 controller with views using Entity Framework. So that will help us to do a lot of the work without having to do a lot of the work. We're going to go ahead and add that. And now I get to choose my model class. Well, my model class is going to be contact. And so I'm just going to start typing in contact. And it finds it, and it's in the contact web models namespace. And the next thing is a data context class. Well, what the heck is this? Well, right now we have a data context class that we don't even really know about. It's the identity models down here. It's going to actually be a DB context if we took a look at it. Now, I don't want to use the same context for my code that I'm using for my authentication. Now, this is for various reasons. Number one, I just want to keep them separate. Number two, if for some reason I decided to store my authentication in a separate database, I wouldn't have to be tightly coupled to the same database that already has my stuff for this specific application. And a lot of times in the real world, you would find that you would need to have context for different databases anyway, just to make sure that you don't have a lot of tightly coupled systems. And that way you would be able to easily interchange parts and work with different databases. So what I'm actually going to do here is create a new data context by clicking on this plus. And I'm going to call it what exactly it says, contact web models, contact web context. So I'm just going to leave it like that. I'm not going to use async controller actions. I'm going to leave everything checked the way it is. And you can see the controller name given to us is contacts controller. So that seems to make sense. Let's go ahead and leave the S in there for this. Our object is a single contact, but this is going to handle all of our contacts. So let's do that. Let's say add. Now the cool part is once we start adding this, it says I'm scaffolding. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, it's actually going to build a bunch of stuff for us into that contacts controller, as well as a bunch of views to render in specific situations for our creating, editing, deleting, and listing operations. And so everything worked, which is awesome. If you got some errors there, remember to make sure that you built before you ran that. And remember to make sure that everything was running and wired up. And then if you had continue to have problems, take a screenshot of the error that you're getting and post it in the forums, or basically start looking into Google, see if there's a way that you can find something on Stack Overflow. But you can see here that it worked just fine as long as we have everything wired up. So hopefully you had that same experience. But that basically built our contacts controller for us. Now we're going to take a deeper look at this in a moment, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But I want to show you that it also created the contact web context, which is a DB context, and it basically is looking for contact web context. And that should also have put something into our web config for contact web context. So you can see that's here, and it's pointing to a new database called contact web context with the date and essentially attaching a new file. So our local connection's already going to be set up, and it's going to be putting it into a separate database. Now the cool thing is when we push this out, we can just wire them to the same database, and that's what I'm going to do rather than trying to create a new one. And we'll get to that eventually. But I just wanted to make you aware that we do have this wired up in a way that we can now separate those databases for our identity and for our contacts. So let's actually, I wanted to show you this really quick. you can see the identity web here is actually, the identity models here is actually going to be handling off of our application DB context. And so that's going to be that default connection. So you can just see that's where that's wired up. So if you wanted to change default connection to be the identity connection, you could easily do that by renaming this, as well as renaming your web config values. Just make sure you do it in both the web config and in the web config release, because you'll want to make sure you have everything wired up correctly if you decide to change that. I'm just going to leave it default. It's not going to make a difference for what we're doing. So the last thing is, note that we have views as well. We have a contacts folder, which is going to line up. Note that it's just this same name without controller. The same thing for account, the same thing for home, the same thing for manage, and then the shared is just for everybody. So you can see every controller gets its own view folder, and it's named exactly the same as what the controller is named without the word controller. And that's extremely important because that's the convention for MVC and Microsoft. And then of course in here we have our listing, we have creating, deleting, editing, and we can actually just view a single contact as well. So we're already wired up, and we're going to take some time in the next couple videos to look at these in more detail. But that wraps up our look at creating controllers and scaffolding the views. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.